Hey guys, how you doing today? I just had this come across my feed, and I think it's probably one of the most important documents I've seen on Venezuela, period. I'm going to be reading this in its totality, so I might need to break this into two parts. I'm going to jump right in. The bottom line is in the title, right? So if you're one of those people that dips out after about 5 minutes, just leave a like now, leave a subscription now. This is the stuff that I do, okay? Please share this one around. I think this is an incredibly important document. And I think it's important for us to hear this and understand it in its totality. So I'm going to read this out loud. United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. Preliminary findings of the visit to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela by the Special Rapporteur in the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. Caracas, 12 February 2021. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, Mrs. Elena Duhan, visited the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela from 1 to 12 February 2021. She thanks the government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela for enabling and supporting her visit to the country. The purpose of the visit was to assess the impact of unilateral sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights by people living in Venezuela and any other affected people. These observations are of a preliminary character, the result of extensive consultations with a wide range of interlocutors. Oh my goodness, words I don't know. The full report will be presented to the United Nations Human Rights Council in September 2021. The Special Rapporteur met with the President and Vice President of the Republic, the Vice Presidents in charge of the executive, legislative, judicial, citizen and electoral powers, the Ministers of Foreign Affairs, Health, Education, Planning, Economy, Finance, Petroleum, Mining, Food, Education, Women and Gender Equality, Blockade, Housing, Social Work, Science, Technology, Transportation, Culture and Indigenous Peoples, the coordinator of the Local Production and Supply Committees, the Secretary General of the Human Rights Committee, the President of Petroleus de Venezuela, the President of the Central Bank, the Director of Telecommunications, the President of the Supreme Court, the General Prosecutor, the Attorney General, President and members of the National Assembly, the Ombudsman, the Executive Secretary of ALBA, representatives of various political parties and trade unions, of national and international humanitarian organizations, of the private sector, of the Catholic Church, as well as Venezuelan non-governmental actors working in the fields of health, human rights, child protection, women and the elderly, medical personnel, university professors, school teachers, and independent researchers. The Special Rapporteur also met with representatives of the United Nations country team and of the diplomatic community. She visited the Children's Heart Hospital, the Quimbotiec pharmaceutical plant, the Canamita complex, the Hugo Chavez Elementary School, and the Ciudad Marsh preschool outside Caracas. In the state of Valencia, the governor I'm so sorry, everyone. The governor facilitated a meeting with the directors of the public companies, water, electricity, gas, and telecoms. The maternity attached to the state hospital, one of the provincial preliminary health centers inspired by the Cuban model, and several non-governmental organizations. The Special Rapporteur extends her thanks and gratitude to all these interlocutors who have generously offered their time, information, analysis, experience, and thoughts to help her understand in a short time what has proved to be a very complex and alarming situation. The Special Rapporteur commends the warm welcome and the constructive and cooperative way in which the government facilitated her visit, which enabled a frank and open dialogue. She expressed her particular thanks to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for its efficient engagement with her office. She also thanks the United Nations Resident Coordinator's Office for its support and advice throughout the visit. Country visit context. The United States has imposed sanctions against Venezuela since 2005, when it introduced targeted sanctions against individuals and entities allegedly involved in drug trafficking. It imposed an arms embargo in 2006 on grounds that the government was failing to cooperate sufficiently in anti-terrorism efforts. In 2014, U.S. law led to sanctions against Venezuelan officials blamed for, inter alia, violently repressing protests, persecuting political opponents, curtailing press freedoms, and corruption. In 2015, the United States declared Venezuela's situation a national emergency, threatening U.S. security and foreign policy. In 2017, the United States called Venezuelan legislative elections illegitimate and imposed sanctions against the government and its entities, including PDVSA, blocking their transactions and access to U.S. financial markets. And this is in bold. In 2018, after Venezuelan presidential elections, the United States tightened its sanctions against the government, citing economic mismanagement, corruption, repression of political opponents, and efforts to undermine democracy. In January 2019, after recognizing legislative leader Juan Guaido as Venezuela's interim president, the United States imposed further sanctions against PDVSA, the Venezuelan central bank, and key government officials. It imposed a total economic embargo in August 2019. The United States also gave Guaido control of the Venezuelan government's assets and property in U.S. bank accounts, including money going to PDVSA from its U.S. unit Citgo. Other U.S. sanctions in 2018 and 2019 targeted the gold and other mining, food, cryptocurrency, and banking sectors. In September 2020, U.S. sanctions were imposed on 5 legislators who led parties cooperating with the government. Since 2020, the United States has tried to block Venezuela from getting fuel from Iran by listing captains of oil tankers, prohibiting the use of Venezuelan air and seaports, and blocking assets of Rosneft. U.S. officials are reported to make unofficial threats to prevent transactions by third state companies with Venezuela. The Special Rapporteur takes note of the U.S. government's decision of 21 January 2020 to revise U.S. sanctions to minimize the humanitarian impact of the pandemic, and the U.S. government action on 2 February 2021 to ease sanctions affecting the functioning of ordinary operations at Venezuelan ports and airports. The European Union imposed sanctions against Venezuela in 2017, including an arms embargo, a ban on exports of other goods that might be used for internal repression, a ban on exports of technology and material made for telecommunications monitoring or interception, and travel bans and asset freezes on individuals whose actions were deemed by the EU to undermine democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, which have been contested by Venezuela before the European Court of Justice. It was also reported that 1.2 billion in Venezuelan government funds have been frozen by a Portuguese bank in 2019. Nearly 2 billion in gold owned by the Central Bank of Venezuela and held in the Bank of England is also frozen as a case proceeds in British courts. In 2017 and 2018, Canada froze assets and banned dealings in the property of Venezuelan officials, accused of repression, gross human rights violations, corruption, censorship, extrajudicial killings, and other acts. In 2019, Mexico froze assets and imposed travel bans on 13 senior Venezuelan officials. In 2018 and 2019, Switzerland imposed an arms embargo on Venezuela and froze assets and imposed travel bans against Venezuelan officials. In 2019, Colombia banned the entry of around 200 Venezuelans with government ties. Panama imposed targeted sanctions against Venezuelan individuals and entities in 2018, considered to be at high risk of engaging in money laundering, terrorist financing, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. In 2019, 13 of the 14 Lima Group countries agreed to ban the entry of Venezuelan officials and deny them access to their financial systems. Also in 2019, a majority of parties to the Rio Treaty approved a resolution allowing targeted sanctions, included asset freezes against Venezuelan officials alleged to participate in drug trafficking, terrorist activities, organized crime, and/or human rights violations. Economic and humanitarian situation in Venezuela. Venezuela has one of the largest reserves of oil on the planet. Oil has been the main export of the country and the main source of revenue and foreign exchange. Since 2000, the government has announced the implementation of a broad scope of social projects in the spheres of housing, education, literacy, food, electricity and water supplies, healthcare, family planning, computer literacy, and commune development, many of which were implemented at no cost to the people or were substantially subsidized by the state. The mono-oriented economy has been highly dependent on oil sales. Most products, from machinery and spare parts to food and medicine, have been imported primarily from the United States and Europe. Internal production has remained at a rather low level and could not meet the needs of internal consumption. The economy's decline started in 2014 with the downturn in oil prices. Among other factors reported to affect the economy of Venezuela, mismanagement, corruption, and state price controls have been cited. Unilateral sanctions, increasingly imposed by the United States, the European Union, and other countries, have exacerbated the above-mentioned calamities. The government's revenue was reported to shrink by 99%, with the country currently living on 1% of its pre-sanctions income. Remittances across the board have decreased due to the blocking of state assets and the complexity of and impediments to bank transfers. 4 years of hyperinflation have resulted in the total devaluation of the national currency. 1 USD equals 1.8 to 1.9 million bolivars. This has resulted in the decrease of public sector salaries from 150 to 500 USD in 2015 to 1 to 10 USD in 2020, and a growing poverty level. In 2018 to 2019, the government introduced new economic policies. Price controls was lifted, and the private sector was allowed to re-enter the economy. However, the hardening of sanctions faced by the country since 2015 undermines the potential positive impact of the current reforms, as well as the state's capacity to maintain infrastructure and implement social projects. Today, Venezuela faces a lack of necessary machinery, spare parts, electricity, water, fuel, gas, food, and medicine. Venezuelan assets frozen in the United States, United Kingdom, and Portuguese banks amount to US $6 billion. The purchase of goods and payments by public companies are reportedly blocked or frozen. The private sector, non-governmental organizations, universities, sports clubs, and citizens of Venezuela are reporting the rejection or reluctance of foreign banks to open or keep their bank accounts, including those with correspondent banks in the United States and Europe. Difficulties with getting visas and buying tickets, the need to act via third country agents, and the need to pay extra insurance costs. The strengthening of economic sanctions and growing overcompliance resulted in the adoption of the anti-blockade constitutional law in October 2020. It has been reported that electricity lines are able to work at less than 20% of their capacity today. The number of Venezuelans who have left the country in search of a better life since 2015 is estimated to range between 4.5 and 5 million, with the population decreasing to approximately 27 million by 2021. Most public services have been depleted of 30 to 50% of their personnel, including their most qualified ones: doctors, nurses, engineers, teachers, professors, judges, police officers, etc., resulting in internal disorganization, increased workloads for remaining personnel, reduced services, and a decline in their quality. An estimated 90% of households are connected to the national water distribution system. Numerous households, however, report frequent cuts because of electricity outages affecting water pumps and the maintenance of infrastructure, and because of the shortage of quality of maintenance staff. The distribution of water can only be made in rotation to ensure its delivery to the entire population, and the majority of households can only get access to water once or twice per week for several hours. Due to the trade impediments, the use of chemical agents to treat and purify the water to make it potable have been reduced by 30%. Impediments to food imports, constituting more than 50% of food consumption, have resulted in the steady growth of malnourishment in the last 6 years, with more than 2.5 million people being severely food insecure. Coping mechanisms include a decrease of the number of meals per day, 1 or 2 instead of 3, reduced quantity and quality of food, decapitalization / selling of household assets to eat, and reduced health, clothing, and education expenses, with correlated increases in family crises, tensions, violence and separations, child labor, involvement in the gray economy, criminal activity, including drug and human trafficking, forced labor, and migration. The CLAP Food Boxes program started as a governmental initiative in 2017 and covering 9 million people around the country, decreases the diversity of items. Venezuela has almost entirely depended upon medicine imported from abroad. While the majority of public medical services were provided by the state free of charge before 2013 to 2016, impediments to health care include a lack of severe inefficiency of medicines and vaccines, price growth, electricity shortages to supply equipment, water shortages and sanitation problems that affect hygiene, decaying infrastructure because of a lack of maintenance, the absence of spare parts, the unavailability of new equipment due to the lack of resources or refusals to sell or deliver, degraded working conditions and a lack of protective equipment against infectious diseases, a loss of staff in all medical areas because of low salaries, and the termination of construction of hospitals and primary care centers. In particular, the Children's Cardiology Hospital in Caracas faces 5 times decrease of the number of surgeries, from an average of 1,000 interventions annually to the period of 2010 to 2014 to 162 in 2020. Medical staff positions in public hospitals are 50 to 70% vacant. Only around 20% of medical equipment is currently functional. The country faces severe shortages of vaccines against measles, yellow fever, and malaria. The lack of tests and treatments for HIV in 2017 and 2018 reportedly resulted in the deaths of more than 5,000 people. The diversion of assets of PDVSA's United States subsidiary, Citgo, has prevented transplants of liver and bone marrow to 53 Venezuelan children. Such transplants were reportedly done in Italy and Argentina before 2016 at the expense of the state. The Special Rapporteur also notes the reported growth of neonatal and maternal mortality since 2013, with a slight improvement in 2019, when humanitarian cooperation with UNICEF, PEJO, Church, and other humanitarian organizations was activated. Other deleterious effects of the crisis are the growing issue of teenage pregnancy, which is rising to a crisis level, with girls of 12 to 13 years getting pregnant amidst a lack of access to information about and use of contraception, and an increase of HIV/AIDS because of unprotected relations. School and university education has faced a serious decrease in governmental support since 2016, including the termination or reduction of supply of school uniforms, shoes, backpacks, and office supplies, and a reduction of the number of daily meals at school from 2 to 1, the diminution of quality of food diversity, or their total cancellation. The unavailability of financial resources and reluctance of foreign companies to trade with Venezuelan public and often private institutions has resulted in the suspension of the Caname program, started in 2015 to assemble compact portable computers for educational purposes, 6.5 million of which have reportedly been distributed through the school system at no charge. Technical incidents in 2019 incapacitated the public Venezuela satellite, substantially shrinking internet coverage in the country and making distant learning in the course of the pandemic hardly possible. In the face of the economic and humanitarian crises, the Venezuelan government activated cooperation with UNDP, UNICEF, UNAIDS, PAHO, and other international agencies, as well as church, private sector, and humanitarian NGOs providing humanitarian aid, facilitating some reconstruction of water systems and supply of vaccines, medicines, tests, reagents, school supplies, and food. Attempts to release funds frozen in the Bank of England for buying medicines, vaccines, protective kits, and medical equipment via the UNDP and PAHO in 2020 have failed, however. Funds have not been released for the purchase of COVAX via PAHO in 2020 to 2021. Despite the intensification of work with humanitarian actors, some cases of surveillance and prosecution of the staff of national NGOs involved in humanitarian work have been reported. I'm going to continue this in a second video. This is quite a dense and long document, and I'm not going to be able to get it done in 1.5 hour video. So please tune in to the second video that will be up very shortly.